Well, good morning from the Cottage farmstead. I'm Rebecca, and today I'm planning on canning a whole bunch of tomato sauce and maybe some diced tomatoes as well, depending on how many I have. But in order to do that, I do need to get this kitchen tamed first, so let's take care of that. If only it was that easy. So like I've mentioned in some of our garden tour videos, this summer has been particularly cool up until a couple weeks ago, and so our tomatoes aren't particularly thriving in our garden. This is probably the first full basket of tomatoes that I have gotten out of our garden the entire summer, and we're already halfway through the month of July, which is unusual for us. So since our garden is not producing enough tomatoes to keep up with our needs for sauce and salsa and other tomato goods, we decided to reach out to some of our local farming friends to see if they had extra tomatoes this year. Since we're obviously not the only ones growing tomatoes in upstate South Carolina, we reached out to a local farm to see if they had what's called seconds. And seconds are ones that are not pretty enough to sell at the farmer's market, or are not high enough quality to go to a retail outlet, or they have a little bit of bruising, or they split. So they're not perfect enough to sell to the masses. And most farmers are more than willing to sell their seconds at a discount because it's better than them throwing them onto the compost pile. So we reached out to Jabo Ranch, who sells a lot of tomatoes in our area, and we asked for some seconds from his harvest this past week. If you're curious about reaching out to local farmers to try and get a bulk rate or a wholesale price or get seconds, I'll leave a link below to a blog post we wrote last year about how to ask your local farmers for excess produce for your own food preservation. One more note before I start chopping these up for tomato sauce is that there sometimes seems to be this mentality that if you didn't grow the food, you can't preserve the food. And that is a total myth. Like this year, our tomato crop, even though we are capable of growing tomatoes, it just didn't do well. And so reaching out to a local farmer is not like this, walk of shame that you weren't able to grow a tomato. It is actually helping prevent food waste, and it actually helps your local farmers to be able to sell something that would have been a waste product that they would have just thrown in the trash or the compost heap. So don't feel any sort of shame that you weren't able to grow all the tomatoes that you needed for the year. It is totally okay to preserve other people's produce that they grew. So the recipe that we use for tomato sauce is from the Ball Book of Canning, and I'll link below to this cookbook. And their recipe in here is pretty basic. It has no seasonings in it. It just helps you get the acidity right for safe water bath canning. And then they have a list of seasoning blends if you want Italian or smoky Mexican or Creole or curry flavored tomato sauce. They give you recipes in here as well. We have found through some experimentation over the last few years what we like in our tomato sauce. We like to keep ours pretty neutral, but we don't want it quite as bland as the basic recipe. We add onions and garlic, a little bit of basil, and a little bit of sugar and salt to our tomato sauce. We want it neutral enough to be able to put it in chili, but we also want to be able to put it as like a pizza sauce on a pizza. So we keep it pretty neutral on far as the herbs and spices that go into it, but we do like a little bit of that onion and garlic flavor in our sauce. So this recipe calls for 15 pounds of tomatoes for 6 pints of tomato sauce. So it's roughly about 2.5 pounds per pint. So I'm gonna start chopping tomatoes and weighing them on a scale to see how many pounds of tomatoes I have, so I can modify the recipe based on the amount of tomatoes that I have. So one trick that we have learned for decreasing the amount of mess of chopping all of these tomatoes is to use a baking tray with our cutting board. So we're cutting on the cutting board inside the baking tray, and all the juices will end up in our baking tray, and we can just dump that out into the sink periodically rather than making a huge mess on the counter. So helps with cleanup. So that ought to be enough tomatoes to get me started. Another thing that I set up is I have a stainless steel bowl here on top of a kitchen scale so I can track how many pounds of tomatoes I have. And I also have another bowl that I'm going to be throwing any of the bad bits or scraps or stem pieces into that I'll be taking out to the chickens later. So when I started chopping, I chose the ones that were the least blemished of the seconds. And when you do get tomato seconds, you are going to have bad tomatoes in the mix. And you might be concerned about using ones that seem off, but tomatoes are very obvious if they have gone totally rotten. They will start dripping and oozing out, and you can smell them. They'll smell like a really horrible fermented smell. As you can see, this one, it's got a lot of juice kind of on it. It's got a hole right here. It's squishy. So I had to cut it open just to see if any part of it is usable, but sometimes you do have to just toss whole tomatoes. So I'm going to cut off this half that had the bad bit on it, and I'm going to give it a smell. And this half still smells like a perfectly normal tomato. So I'm usually, out of precaution, I do cut off a fair amount of it, but I can toss it to the chickens so it does not go to total waste. With one like this, I can see that it's been oozing. It's starting to turn an off color, and whew, it smells really horrible. So it's very obvious when a tomato has gone bad. So I wouldn't be super concerned about cutting off like a superficial blemish or, you know, a little bit of a crack or a soft spot out of it. But if it starts smelling like this, it's gone bad. So now that I have about half the tomatoes chopped up, I am going to start sauteing in my large stock pot here the onion that I want in my tomato sauce. The main reason I'm doing this is I have run out of space in the bowl that I'm chopping into, and I need to start dumping it into my stock pot, but I want this onion sauteed just a little bit before I start doing that. All right, so I have finished chopping all of the tomatoes, and I have my onions and garlic sauteing over there on the other side of the stove. I ended up having about a little over 12 pounds of tomatoes, and the recipe calls for 15 pounds. So I'm gonna have to do a little bit of math to calculate how much salt and citric acid or lemon juice I need to add to the recipe, but otherwise I got pretty close. I should be getting around 5 pints, maybe 6 with the addition of the onions and garlic of tomato sauce out of this. So this recipe calls for bringing the tomato quarters up to a boil and letting them simmer for 15 minutes. So while I wait on that, I'm gonna go eat my lunch and I'll be right back. So while you may have thought you left algebra back in high school, it still does come in handy, especially when working in the kitchen and trying to figure out ratios of ingredients. So since it called for 15 pounds and I had 12.5 pounds, you divide 12.5 by 15 and you get that you have 0.83333 of a recipe. Then I go to, okay, I need 1.5 teaspoons of citric acid. So I just take the 1.25 and I multiply it by the 0.833 to get how much I need. So we got 0.83 times 1.5 teaspoons means I need about 1.25 teaspoons in this recipe. For the tablespoon of salt, when you multiply by 1, you're gonna get 0.8333. So essentially I need a little bit over 3/4 of a tablespoon of salt. When I'm doing normal cooking in the kitchen, I am not usually trying to be this precise. I eyeball a lot of the ingredients, but for canning, I do like to make sure that I have the acid ratio I need when I'm water bath canning, so I want to be careful to have the precise amount I need. Similar with the salt, I don't want to overdo it. So I make sure that I get approximately the right amount of salt that I need in there when I'm modifying a recipe. So while this recipe calls for taking this out in batches and running it through a food mill, we have found that the immersion blender does just as good of a job. If you don't have any digestive issues with consuming the tomato seeds or the skins, then there's not really any need to take this out in batches and run it through a food mill, since you're just going to puree it anyways. So we found that we can just put the immersion blender right into the pot, and it saves a whole lot of time to just get it into a puree in the pot that we're going to continue cooking the sauce in. Now that we've got it pureed, we need to let it simmer for 45 minutes while the water evaporates and it reduces down so that we get to a more sauce-like texture for canning. So while we wait on the tomato sauce to simmer and reduce down, let's open one of my birthday presents this year. So when we were building this house, we decided to go all electric for our appliances. And with that, we wanted to be as energy efficient as possible because we would like to get on solar power eventually. So we went with an induction stove. And it's been a little bit of a learning curve. We've had to eliminate some of our pots and pans that just weren't magnetic and therefore wouldn't heat up on a induction range. Sadly, it turns out that pretty much all my canning supplies were also not magnetic and therefore would not heat on an induction stove. So it's been very tricky canning so far this year. I've been trying a diffusion plate. I was trying to can outside on an outdoor burner, but I've been really hoping to be able to do small batches inside where it's air conditioned on some of these 97 to 100 degree days that we have in July and August. So I was very excited that my in-laws gifted me this stainless steel steam canner. The steam canner only requires a couple inches of water in the bottom of the pot, and it will work just the same as a water bath canner, so you can follow all the water bath canning instructions on a recipe. So let's get this open. So while we have about 30 to 45 minutes before I need to start getting the steam canner going, I'm gonna take out these scraps to the chickens and make them very happy. While we continue to wait on the tomato sauce to reduce down, I've come down into the basement to get the rest of the canning supplies that we need. So I got some of the jars and some of the rims here in my box that I'll be using to carry them back upstairs. I need a couple more jars and the lids and my canning tongs as well to take back upstairs. So I just got the steam canner here on the stove and got my jars in there, so they'll start sterilizing as it heats up. My sauce has been reducing for about 45 minutes to an hour now. I turned it up a little bit because it hasn't reduced quite as much as I wanted it to, so hopefully that steam will get a bit more of the water out of it. So while it's not required to do this anymore, I do still like to put my canning lids in a pot of warm water. It's not full boil, but hot enough that it'll start softening the seals on these, so they tend to seal better, at least in my experience. And while I've been waiting on the sauce to simmer down, I had enough jalapenos to make 1 jar of cowboy candy, so that's gonna go in the canner as well. So steam canners have a little gauge on the top that will indicate that you are at the correct steam level that you need in order to begin your processing time that's in your recipe. So mine just got there, so I started my timer for 35 minutes, and so I'm gonna go do some other chores around the house and come back and check on it in a half an hour. So the first batch of tomato sauce is out of the canner, and I have the last 4 jars in there right now. I've already heard a few of them popping, so it's lovely to hear them start sealing and getting ready to go into our pantry for this coming winter. This sauce is a little bit more watery than I normally like to do tomato sauce, but the main reason is that I didn't use paste or Roma tomatoes that have a little bit less juice in them. I was using beefsteak tomatoes, which is what we had available to us at Seconds this year, so it's a little bit more watery than normal, but it's no big deal. When I'm cooking a chili or something in the future, I just need to simmer it for a couple more minutes to get the extra liquid out, which is not a major problem. Well, I hope you enjoyed seeing the tomato sauce canning process from start to finish here in the Cottage kitchen. I hope it inspires you to start preserving some of your own food. There's nothing quite like opening up a can of tomato sauce in the middle of the winter to put on pizza or make some chili, to have a taste of the summer and deep winter. Well, happy growing and preserving, friends, and we'll catch you next time.